Picture the Northern Territory: red dust roads, ancient sandstone gorges, coastlines that look like they belong to nobody. Wide open, remote, free. Except that several of the most striking landscapes in the top end are not open to anyone who simply shows up. And in 2026, the permit systems governing those places are more structured, more specific, and more legally grounded than most travellers ever realise before they book their flights. What nobody mentions in the travel brochure is that remote and accessible are not the same thing out here. Some of these places will turn you around at a gate. Some will require you to carry paperwork on your person. And some require something harder to obtain than any form. The Northern Territory holds the largest area of Aboriginal-owned land in Australia. The permit systems operating across Arnhem Land, the Tiwi Islands, the Groote Archipelago, and the desert corridors west of Uluru are not legacy bureaucracy or inconvenient red tape. They are the practical expression of the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act of 1976. Federal law that recognised Aboriginal people as the legal owners of their land. That law is still operating, still enforced, and still shaping who gets to go where in 2026. These are not obscure loopholes. They are functioning legal frameworks administered by bodies like the Northern Land Council, the Central Land Council, the Tiwi Land Council, the Nhulunbuy Land Council, and Dhimurru Aboriginal Corporation. And most visitors have no idea how many places fall under them. Here are 8 places in the Northern Territory where access is not simply a matter of driving in, and where knowing the rules before you go is the difference between a legal visit and a serious mistake. Start at the top of the map. The Cobourg Peninsula pushes out into the Arafura Sea from the northern edge of Arnhem Land, and for a certain kind of traveller, it looks like the ultimate remote destination. White beaches fringed by monsoon forest, coral clear water, a coastline that barely registers on most tourist itineraries. Garig Gunak Barlu National Park covers the majority of that peninsula, and it sits at the intersection of 2 distinct but overlapping systems of authority. It is both a national park and a protected area on Aboriginal land. All that means in practice is that access is not a casual decision. The NT government is explicit on this point. A permit is required to enter and stay in the Cobourg Peninsula and Garig Gunak Barlu National Park. That is not a suggestion left to the discretion of the individual traveller. The permit conditions are real, they are checked, and visitors are required to report to rangers upon entering the park. If you show up without one, you are not in a grey area. You are in violation of permit law. The physical reality of reaching the park makes this even more concrete. The Cobourg Peninsula is roughly 270 kilometres northeast of Darwin as the crow flies, but there is no sealed road, no regular ferry service, and no casual route in. The main access track, if conditions allow, involves negotiating the Arnhem Land escarpment. You are not arriving by accident. Every person who reaches the park boundary got there through deliberate effort, which makes the permit requirement less of a procedural formality and more of a statement of intent that you respect the place and its governance before you even leave Darwin. The landscape inside the park is genuinely unlike most of what tourists see in the Northern Territory. The coastline holds the ruins of Port Essington, a 19th century British colonial outpost that was established in 1838 and abandoned by 1849 after disease, isolation, and the sheer difficulty of sustaining a settlement that far from any support infrastructure finally wore the project down. The ruins are still there, crumbling stone walls sitting in monsoon forest, close enough to the beach that the salt air is a constant presence. It is the kind of place that forces you to reckon with the difference between arriving somewhere and actually belonging there, a gap that the British colonists experienced catastrophically and that the permit system today addresses in a far more deliberate way. The wildlife is part of the picture too, and it is not a soft backdrop. Saltwater crocodiles are active in the waterways, the estuaries, and along significant stretches of the coastline. The park contains one of the highest densities of saltwater crocodile habitat in the Northern Territory, which is saying something in a territory where croc warnings are already standard operating procedure. Understanding the crocodile situation is part of what the permit and ranger contact framework facilitates. Rangers can give current information about specific areas and conditions that no travel website can replicate in real time. For serious bird watchers, the peninsula is one of the more significant sites in the top end. The combination of mangrove systems, monsoon rainforest patches, coastal heathland, and open woodland creates layered habitat, and the Cobourg Peninsula records species that do not appear regularly anywhere else in the NT. But again, the point of the permit framework is not to curate a wildlife experience. It is to ensure that the number of people moving through a place with limited infrastructure, genuine ecological sensitivity, and a legal framework of Aboriginal ownership remains at a level that the land and its custodians can accommodate. Ask anyone who has made the trip under proper permit conditions and they will say roughly the same thing. The permission process itself changes how you arrive. You are not a tourist wandering through a postcard. You are a guest who has been allowed in. That distinction matters in ways that are difficult to articulate until you are standing on a beach at the northern edge of Arnhem Land, looking at the Arafura Sea, with a permit in your pack and rangers who know you are there. Kakadu National Park is the place most people think they understand. It appears in enough travel guides, documentaries and promotional campaigns that visitors tend to arrive with a sense of confident familiarity. They know about yellow water. They know about Ubir. They know about the flat-topped escarpments and the floodplain that turns into a mirror during the wet season. What most of them do not know is that one of the most extraordinary gorges in the entire park is not reachable by any of those familiar routes, and it requires a permit that is entirely separate from the standard Kakadu entry fee. Jarrangbarnmi, also known as Koolpin Gorge, sits in the southern reaches of Kakadu, away from the concentrated visitor circuit that most people follow. Parks Australia and Kakadu National Park Management are clear. A permit is required to bushwalk or camp at Jarrangbarnmi. This is not a voluntary registration system or a courtesy heads-up. The number of visitors permitted to be in the gorge at any given time is limited, and the application process exists precisely to enforce that limit. And the system goes further than just obtaining a permit. Unlike many Kakadu sites where you park and walk, Koolpin Gorge involves gate and key arrangements as part of the access process. That means the physical infrastructure of the site reflects the permit framework. You cannot just drive around it or find a way in that avoids the requirement. The gate is there. The key is part of what you receive when your permit application is processed. It is an unusually concrete expression of controlled access in a landscape that might otherwise look like open wilderness. The gorge itself warrants that level of attention. The sandstone walls of Jarrangbarnmi rise above a series of freshwater pools, set into the rock in a way that makes the landscape feel compressed and layered. The rock art present in this part of Kakadu represents some of the oldest continuous artistic traditions in the world. The figures and symbols on the stone walls are not decoration, they are records, and they are directly connected to the Bininj and Mungai peoples whose country this is. The permit system is not protecting a scenic backdrop, it is protecting a living cultural landscape. The seasonal dimension adds another layer. Kakadu's wet season transforms the park in ways that make many areas genuinely inaccessible. Roads flood, tracks wash out, and the escarpment country shifts from dusty and navigable to a flowing, waterlogged system almost overnight. The permit requirement at Koolpin Gorge operates within that reality. Conditions in the gorge, water levels and access track status matter, and the limited number permit structure keeps the gorge from becoming a site where visitors exceed what the place can safely or culturally absorb during any given period. There is something worth sitting with here. Kakadu is a UNESCO World Heritage Area, inscribed for both its natural and cultural values. But the World Heritage status does not override the permit structure at Koolpin Gorge. It sits alongside it. The cultural significance that contributed to the UNESCO listing is the same cultural significance that makes the permit framework at Jarrangbarnmi necessary. Those two things are not in contradiction. They are expressions of the same reality. This is an extraordinary place precisely because it has been governed carefully for a very long time. The drawback, if you are planning around the gorge, is that the permit plus key arrangement system means your access is not flexible once you have confirmed a visit. You are committed to a specific time frame, specific conditions, and specific responsibilities. For travellers who are used to improvising their itinerary based on how they feel that morning, Jarrangbarnmi demands a different kind of preparation. That preparation is not a burden, it is the point. Checkpoint A. The first two places sit inside national park frameworks where the permit is a defined procedure with a body to contact and a form to complete. The next case operates differently. It is not a park, it is a road, and the permission you need is not for camping or walking, it is for driving. One number from the Central Land Council's permit guidance will tell you something important about how that works. There is a route in Central Australia that connects two of the most visited landscapes in the country, the West MacDonnell Ranges and Wataka, the park that contains Kings Canyon. On a map, the Mereenie Loop Road looks like an obvious shortcut, the kind of logical connector that reduces driving time and opens up a circular itinerary through Red Rock country. That reading of the map is accurate in terms of distance. It misses something critical in terms of law. The Mereenie Loop crosses Aboriginal land. That means travellers need a transit permit to drive it, and that permit comes from the Central Land Council. I know what the word transit sounds like. It sounds like the most minimal possible form of permission, like waving someone through. But the CLC is specific about what the Mereenie Loop transit permit actually means, and it is worth reading that guidance carefully. A transit permit is not an entry permit. Those are different instruments, and the distinction has real consequences for how you can behave on that road. What the transit permit covers is movement along the road itself. What it does not cover is camping along the route, exploring side tracks, entering communities, or treating the landscape on either side of the sealed line as available for casual use. The CLC's guidance is clear that the transit nature of the permit does not extend into the country through which the road passes. You have permission to travel from one point to another. You do not have permission for the land itself. This is a distinction that matters more than it might initially appear. The Mereenie Loop passes through country that has deep cultural significance to the Western Aranda and other Aboriginal peoples of Central Australia. The red landscape, the low ranges, the dry creek beds, none of it is simply scenery. It is country with specific ownership, specific custodians, and specific protocols that the transit permit does not unlock. The road is a corridor. The country around it is something else entirely. For many visitors to the Northern Territory, the Mereenie Loop is the first place where the permit system becomes tangible in a landscape context rather than an administrative one. Parks and gorges feel like places where rules make intuitive sense. You are entering something bounded, managed, clearly designated. A road feels different. A road looks public by its very nature. The physical experience of driving it does not signal restriction in the way that a locked gate does. And that is exactly why the permit requirement is easy to overlook, and why overlocking it carries legal weight, not just social awkwardness. The practical detail that helps fix this in memory: the transit permit for the Mereenie Loop needs to be obtained before you travel, not collected at a gate or self-registered on arrival. Planning ahead is not optional, and if you are combining the loop with other travel in Central Australia, you need to be clear about which permits cover which areas. The Mereenie transit permit does not generalise into a pass for surrounding country, and the CLC permit system covers multiple areas across Central Australia that each have their own application requirements. The road itself is a corrugated, unsealed track for most of its length, crossing the kind of terrain that rewards a high-clearance vehicle and punishes overconfidence. The physical difficulty of the route and the permit requirement together are a reasonable summary of what travel in genuine remote Australia involves. It takes preparation, it takes respect for the conditions, and it takes acknowledgement that you are moving through country that is not yours. The permit is the formal expression of that acknowledgement. If the Mereenie Loop is where the permit system first surprises Central Australian travellers, the Central Arnhem Road is where top-end travellers encounter the same reality at a different scale. The road runs from the Stuart Highway near Katherine, east into Arnhem Land, connecting to Nhulunbuy on the Cobourg Peninsula, a distance of close to 700 kilometres through some of the most isolated country in the Northern Territory. It is a route with genuine logistical demands, a road that experienced four-wheel drive travellers plan carefully around fuel, water and weather. The Northern Land Council administers the transit permit required to drive the Central Arnhem Road. The requirement comes directly from the fact that the road crosses Aboriginal land. Land recognised under the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act of 1976, the same federal legislation that underpins permit systems across the top end. You are not driving through public land that happens to have Aboriginal communities nearby. You are driving through land that is legally owned by Aboriginal people, and the transit permit is how that ownership is formally acknowledged by travellers passing through. The transit framing matters here, for exactly the same reasons it matters on the Mereenie Loop, but the scale of the Central Arnhem Road makes the implications more acute. At 700 kilometres, the road takes at minimum a full day to drive under reasonable conditions. In the wet season, significant sections become impassable, and travellers who have not planned properly, fuel, water, mechanical reliability, and permit, do not just face inconvenience, they face situations where rescue is genuinely complicated by the remoteness. The permit is one of several essential components of responsible travel on this route, not an add-on for completeness. The transit permit is not a licence to camp alongside the road, wander into communities you pass, or explore side tracks into surrounding country. Visit East Arnhem Access Guidance is specific on this point. The permit covers passage, not exploration. Communities along the Central Arnhem Road have their own protocols, their own governance, and their own relationship to visitors that a transit document does not automatically open. If you want to stop in a community, that requires different and separate arrangements, typically involving invitation, relationship, or specific permit provisions beyond the transit instrument. The country through which the road passes is Arnhem Land escarpment country in its western sections, transitioning through woodland and eventually toward the monsoon-influenced coastal country of the Cobourg Peninsula as you move east. This is country with an unbroken connection to the Aboriginal peoples who have governed it since long before any road existed. The escarpment around Koolpin Gorge grades into the broader Arnhem Land plateau, and the sense of scale, the depth of the escarpment walls, the spread of the woodland, the seasonal transformation of the floodplain country, is something that no permit restricts you from experiencing through the windscreen. What the permit framework does is establish the terms under which you are present. You are in transit through someone else's country, and the permit is the mechanism by which that transit is recognised and authorised. Residents who live along the route, travellers who have driven the Central Arnhem Road with appropriate documentation, and tour operators licensed to work in Arnhem Land all describe the road in similar terms. It is not the permit that defines the experience, it is the country itself. The permit is just the honest acknowledgement that you are a guest there. Checkpoint B. Every case so far has a permit body you can name, a form you can find, and a process you can follow from a desktop computer before you leave home. The next place sits 80 kilometres from Darwin by ferry. But proximity to Darwin has nothing to do with whether you need permission to be there. What happens when the permit system meets a place that most people assume is effectively part of the city? 80 kilometres north of Darwin, across the Clarence Strait, lie Bathurst Island and Melville Island. Together they are known as the Tiwi Islands, and on a clear day, the Darwin waterfront points almost directly toward them. Melville Island is the second largest island in Australia. The distance by ferry is short enough that you could theoretically be standing on Tiwi soil within an hour and a half of leaving Darwin Harbour. None of that proximity changes what is required to be there legally. The Tiwi Islands are Aboriginal land, recognised under the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act of 1976. The Tiwi Land Council manages access, and in 2026 the visitor permit system it administers is the gateway for anyone planning to travel to the islands outside of a specific approved arrangement. The Tiwi Land Council's permit pages are direct about this. Visitors wishing to travel to the Tiwi Islands need to apply for a permit, and permit holders are required to carry their documentation with them. The islands are not an open destination, where geographic proximity implies cultural or legal accessibility. The Tiwi people have one of the most distinctive cultural traditions in Australia. Their artistic heritage, Tiwi art, with its characteristic geometric forms, ochre palettes, and connection to ceremony, is internationally recognised and commercially significant. Tiwi football is a cultural institution that has produced some of the most influential players in the history of the AFL. The Tiwi Islands have a living, active community culture that is not a museum piece or a performance for visitors. It is the daily life of a community that has its own governance, its own relationship to land, and its own authority over who visits and under what conditions. The Tiwi Land Council visitor protocols make explicit that permit holders must carry their permits and must understand what the permit does and does not authorise. This is worth taking seriously. The islands are not a tourist attraction with a ticket booth at the entrance. They are a community, actually multiple communities across 2 large islands, and the people who live there are not background scenery. The permit framework exists because the Tiwi Islands are governed by the Tiwi people, and the terms of visits are set by that governance, not by visitor expectations. There is a ferry service that operates between Darwin and Bathurst Island, and there are licensed tour operators who can take visitors to the Tiwi Islands under organised arrangements. Those arrangements involve permits. If you are booking a tour through an approved operator, that process typically includes the permit in the arrangements, but it is worth verifying, not assuming. If you are planning independent travel to the islands, the Tiwi Land Council permit application is the starting point, and the Tiwi Visitor Protocols page describes conditions that govern your presence once you are there. The honest drawback for independent travellers is that the Tiwi Islands are not set up for casual backpacker-style exploration. Infrastructure outside the main communities is limited. The islands are large. Melville Island alone covers close to 6,000 square kilometres, and moving through them without prior arrangement and without clear permit authorisation is not simply logistically complicated, it is legally problematic. The permit framework is not an obstacle to a well-planned visit. It is the framework within which a well-planned visit operates. What the permit system is protecting, among other things, is the capacity of Tiwi communities to receive visitors on their own terms. The cultural significance of the islands is not incidental to that protection. It is the point. The Tiwi Islands are 80 kilometres from Darwin, and they are, in every meaningful sense, a different jurisdiction. Nhulunbuy sits at the tip of the Cobourg Peninsula in East Arnhem Land, and for travellers who have made the long drive along the Central Arnhem Road or flown in on the Go flight, the beaches around the town look like exactly the kind of reward that remote travel promises. Coastal rock formations, red dirt meeting the Arafura Sea, clear water, and a sense of having arrived somewhere genuinely far from the tourist circuit. That picture is accurate. The part that visitors regularly miss is that many of those beaches and coastal areas are managed by Dhimurru Aboriginal Corporation, and a visitor access permit from Dhimurru is required to access Dhimurru Recreation Areas. Dhimurru was established to manage the interface between the broader population around Nhulunbuy, which includes a significant non-Aboriginal mining and service community, and the surrounding Yolngu-owned land. The recreation area system it administers gives permit-holding visitors access to specified coastal tracts, beaches, and areas around the Cobourg Peninsula. It is a practical model that acknowledges the reality of a mixed population region while maintaining Yolngu authority over the land. The permit is not a high barrier. It is obtainable through Dhimurru's permit system, but it is not optional, and the boundary between the recreation areas and the broader Aboriginal land is not a casual line. The distinction that Dhimurru and Visit East Arnhem both emphasise is important. A visitor access permit for Dhimurru recreation areas does not open all of East Arnhem Land. The permit is specific to the recreation areas around Nhulunbuy and Yirrkala. Adjacent land, coastal areas outside the designated recreation zones, and the surrounding Arnhem Land are governed by different permit requirements, primarily through the Northern Land Council for travel deeper into the region. Holding a Dhimurru permit does not generalise into a pass for the broader East Arnhem Land territory. Yirrkala is a community a short distance from Nhulunbuy that carries extraordinary significance in the history of Australian law. It was from Yirrkala that the Yolngu people in 1963 sent petitions to the Australian Parliament, the Yirrkala Church Panels and the Yirrkala Petition, in response to the excision of Aboriginal land for bauxite mining without consultation. Those petitions were the first formal recognition by an Australian Parliament of an Aboriginal document, and they are foundational to the legal history that eventually produced the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976. The permit system governing access to this area today is not disconnected from that history. It is a direct continuation of it. The Aboriginal Land Act, Northern Territory, of 1980 provides additional legislative grounding for the Dhimurru system in this region. The intersection of federal and territory-level legislation means that the permit requirements in and around Nhulunbuy sit on multiple layers of legal authority, not just the goodwill of a local organisation. Dhimurru's role is to translate that authority into practical land management, and the visitor access permit is how individual visitors engage with that management structure. For travellers who reach Nhulunbuy, which itself requires either flying or completing one of the most demanding drives in the Northern Territory, the Dhimurru permit system is worth approaching as the final stage of preparation rather than an afterthought. The coastal country around the Cobourg Peninsula is genuinely striking. The red bauxite cliffs, the complex mangrove systems, the offshore waters. It is a landscape worth the effort. But arriving with a permit in hand, understanding what it covers and what it does not, is the difference between a visit conducted with integrity and one that inadvertently crosses legal and cultural lines. Checkpoint C. Everything described so far involves a permit system that can be initiated with an internet connection and a completed application form. The next place operates under a different set of layers, not just who owns the land above the waterline, but how mining leases, community boundaries, and wilderness areas intersect in ways that make the map far more complex than it appears from the outside. One single island in the Gulf of Carpentaria holds all of those layers simultaneously. Groote Eylandt is one of the largest islands in Australia, sitting in the Gulf of Carpentaria off the eastern coast of Arnhem Land. It is not a place most visitors to the Northern Territory think about when they are planning an itinerary. It does not appear on the standard Darwin, Kakadu, Catherine, Alice Springs circuit. It does not have a famous gorge or a UNESCO listing that drives visitor numbers. What it has is one of the most layered land access frameworks in the Northern Territory, administered by the Nhulunbuy Land Council, which represents the Nhulunbuy people, the traditional owners of Groote Eylandt and the surrounding archipelago. The Nhulunbuy Land Council permit material is specific about what access requires. Visitors and residents both need recreation permits for off-lease areas and permits for restricted areas on Groote Eylandt. That distinction, off-lease areas versus restricted areas, matters because Groote Eylandt contains multiple overlapping land use categories: communities, mining lease areas, pastoral land, and areas of traditional significance. The map of the island is not a simple public or private divide. It is a layered system of lease, land rights, community governance, and conservation interest, and the permit framework reflects that complexity. The Gemco manganese mine on Groote Eylandt has operated since 1966 and represents one of the largest manganese deposits in the world. The mining operation occupies lease areas that are distinct from the surrounding Aboriginal land, and the coexistence of a significant industrial operation with traditional ownership and community life creates a land use picture that visitors rarely encounter in such compressed form elsewhere in Australia. The Nhulunbuy Land Council operates in this context, advocating for traditional owners or managing land access across a landscape that is simultaneously ancient and industrially active. For travellers, the practical implication is that arriving on Groote Eylandt does not place you on freely accessible terrain. Off-lease areas, which include much of the coastline, many of the natural landscapes, and the surrounding archipelago, require the recreation permit from the Nhulunbuy Land Council. Restricted areas require a separate land access permit. The ableist permit guidance for the Nhulunbuy Land Council confirms both categories, and the application process is through the council rather than through a general NT government portal. The Groote Archipelago itself, the scatter of smaller islands surrounding Groote Eylandt, contains country of deep significance to the Nhulunbuy people. The archipelago's coastal margins, island environments, and marine country are not peripheral to Nhulunbuy cultural geography. They are central to it. The permit system covering the archipelago is an expression of the same principle that governs access everywhere else on this list. The land has owners, the owners have authority, and visitors are guests rather than right holders. The drawbacks of visiting without proper permit arrangements are not abstract. The Nhulunbuy Land Council has the authority to require people to leave restricted areas, and entering land in violation of permit requirements is a breach of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. In a remote island environment with limited transport options, the combination of legal exposure and logistical complexity makes permit compliance not just ethically correct, but practically essential. Residents who have worked in the region describe the permit framework as straightforward once you understand the categories, but you do need to understand them before you arrive, because there is no informal leeway once you are standing in a restricted area. The wilderness of the Gulf Coast country around Groote Eylandt, the mangrove systems, the offshore reefs, the open savanna woodland of the island's interior, is a landscape of genuine scale and depth. The archipelago holds marine ecosystems that are among the least disturbed in the Gulf of Carpentaria. The Nhulunbuy Land Council's land management work is part of what keeps it that way. Visiting with the right documentation is not an inconvenience grafted onto the experience. It is how the experience is supposed to work. Every place on this list has a permit body, an application process, and a formal framework that you can engage with from your home computer. Most of them involve a procedure that, with appropriate notice and legitimate purpose, produces a document that authorises your travel. Galiwin'ku is different. Not because it lacks a permit system. The Northern Land Council administers visitor permits for Aboriginal land in the top end, and NLC permit guidance covers Arnhem Land communities and travel in East Arnhem. Galiwin'ku falls within that framework. But Galiwin'ku makes the permit system feel like what it actually is, the formal edge of a relationship, not the relationship itself. Galiwin'ku sits on Elcho Island, off the northeast coast of Arnhem Land. It is one of the larger Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, a place where Yolngu families have lived continuously, where cultural practices have been maintained, transmitted, and adapted across generations, and where the daily life of a functioning community goes on entirely independent of whether any visitor ever arrives. The island is accessible by air from Darwin, and there are NT permit guidance materials covering Arnhem Land travel that include East Arnhem communities. But the formal permit structure is the minimum, not the whole picture. The Northern Land Council's role in administering visitor permits for Aboriginal land in the top end is grounded in the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act of 1976. That Act recognised Aboriginal Australians as the legal owners of their land, and the permit system is how that ownership is expressed in terms of visitor access. For Galiwin'ku, that means arrival by someone without appropriate authorisation, whether that is an NLC permit, an invitation from community members, or an arrangement through organisations with established relationships in the community, is not treated as casual visiting. It is entering someone else's home without being asked. That framing, home rather than tourist destination, is exactly the right one for Galiwin'ku, and it is the framing that distinguishes this community from several other entries on this list. A gorge in Kakadu, a road through the desert, a beach near Nhulunbuy, those are landscapes, and their permit requirements govern access to country. Galiwin'ku is a community. The people there are not an attraction. The culture, the art, the music, the ceremonies, those are not performances staged for visitors. They are the private and communal life of a people who have occupied Elcho Island since long before any external government existed to recognise or authorise their presence there. The permit system in this context carries a weight that is different from the gate and key arrangement at Koolpin Gorge or the transit permit on the Central Arnhem Road. You might think that sounds overstated. It is a form, it goes to an office, a permit comes back. I understand that reading, and it is not entirely wrong. The process is a process. But the process exists because the community has the right to determine who enters, and that right is not symbolic. It is legally grounded, actively enforced, and ethically non-negotiable. The NT permit guidance for Arnhem Land travel is accessible through the Northern Land Council's permit pages, and anyone planning legitimate travel that takes them near East Arnhem communities, including Galiwin'ku, should begin there. The NLC permit framework covers different categories of travel and purpose. Some permits are for transit, some are for entry, some are specific to particular communities or areas. Understanding which category your planned travel falls into is essential, and the NLC guidance exists precisely to help navigate that. The Yolngu cultural landscape that Galiwin'ku sits within is one of the richest and most sustained in Australia. The musical traditions of East Arnhem Land, yidaki playing, songlines, the ceremonial knowledge embedded in Yolngu artistic practice, have been recognised internationally while remaining deeply rooted in country and community. The Yirrkala petition of 1963, already mentioned in the context of Nhulunbuy, was part of a broader assertion of Yolngu sovereignty that eventually changed Australian constitutional and legal history. The permit system is not an imposition on that history, it is a product of it. For the kind of visitor who is genuinely interested in East Arnhem Land, its landscape, its cultural depth, its place in the broader story of Australia, the permit is not the barrier. The preparation is the barrier, and it is a worthwhile one. Organisations that run culturally appropriate tours in East Arnhem Land, licensed operators with established relationships in Yirrkala communities, and structured programmes that bring visitors into contact with Arnhem Land culture on Yirrkala terms do exist. They require lead time, proper documentation, and a visitor who is prepared to be a guest rather than a consumer. The permit is where that preparation begins. There is no shortcut here and no workaround. The community at Galiwin'ku is not waiting for visitors to find the right angle of approach. It is governing its own land and its own terms of engagement with the outside world, as it has the legal and moral authority to do. Arrival without authorization is not an adventure. It is a transgression of someone else's home. And if there is a single phrase that summarizes everything this list of 8 places is about, that is it. The Arafura Sea stretches north from Elcho Island into open water. The sky over East Arnhem Land goes orange and then dark in the evenings, in a way that photographs have been trying and failing to capture for decades. The country is extraordinary by any measure, and the people who own it have built a legal framework through struggle and through law that gives them the authority to say who enters. That authority is not a footnote to the landscape. It is inseparable from it. 8 places across the Northern Territory where showing up is not the same as being welcome, where the landscape, the law, and the people who own the land have built systems that ask something of every visitor before they arrive. Some of those systems involve a form and a permit body. One of them involves something closer to a relationship. The question this raises is not whether the permit systems are inconvenient. The question is what kind of traveller you want to be in places that have been asking for respect far longer than any government has been authorised to grant it. Which of these 8 places would you actually make the effort to visit properly? Permit in hand, conditions understood, prepared to be a guest on someone else's country? Write it in the comments. And if this kind of documentary takes you somewhere the travel brochures don't, subscribe. There is more country